Alright, so here we go into our last of our progressive presidents. This is Woodrow Wilson. Now, Woodrow Wilson is known more importantly, I guess, if you will, for the WW, as his initials would imply, World War One, and that's what we'll go after, imperialism and things like that. Okay? So, election of 1912, as I said, three men, Teddy and Taft, and then Wilson. Now, what actually happens is Teddy and Taft split the Republican vote. And so what happens is that paves the way for the Democrat, Woodrow Wilson, to win. All right? Now, there was a big talk in this, and that was new nationalism versus new freedom. Now, new nationalism was Teddy Roosevelt's idea, and you can see it there. He favored legislation to protect women, children, and workers, whereas Wilson criticized the new nationalism for supporting regulated monopolies, said the approach to the federal government gave too much power, and he argued for free enterprise, let them do what they want. As I said, Roosevelt and Taft split the Republican vote, and Wilson wins. Now, this is the first time we really hear the term regulation on the federal terms. Now, states try to regulate things. So what is actually regulation? Regulation goes against laissez-faire, and it's the idea that you have to check what these things are doing, make sure they're abiding by guidelines that are set by the federal government, and so you can do that, okay? An example of something that would be regulated is if you've ever watched TV and you hear a beep, somebody is regulating what you're watching on TV. And that's part of something that's called FCC. We'll talk about that in the 60s, all right? So, ahead of myself. Now, one of the first acts to be passed in Congress under the term of Woodrow Wilson is the Adamson Act. Now, the Adamson Act, you can see the worker here is running away. They actually call this the Magna Carta of Workers. This basically said national, big thing, 8-hour workday around the whole country. And so that was a really important thing for that. And if you can actually read it, it actually says 8-hour law on the paper there. All right? Now, the next thing is a regulatory body. It is called the Federal Trade Commission. Now, the Federal Trade Commission actually has a weird statue out in front. It's a bull, and it's a man wrestling the bull. It's called man versus trade. So the Federal Trade Commission is to protect America's consumers from what are called unfair trade practices. It's still in effect today, and they basically make sure that you're not going to be messed over or pulled the wool over your eyes or whatever you want to call it, okay? Now, another big thing of Wilson, the Congress of Wilson, is the Clayton Antitrust. The Clayton Antitrust really strengthened the whole idea that we don't want to trust. But the big thing is it actually gave unions more power because it legalized unions, strikes, boycotts, and pickets. Remember I said the Sherman Antitrust would be used against unions. Now they said no, unions can't, they're not a trust, so you can't do that. They have the right to strike, they have the right to picket, they have the right to do all these things. And you just have to either accept it or move on. Now, Wilson's lasting impression, the really big thing that happened was called the Glass-Owen Act. It's also called the Federal Reserve Act. You can see there it is a currency law. So he is going to sign into law the two senators of Penn, of Glass and Owen, and we call it the Federal Reserve Act, and it has to do with money. Now, the Federal Reserve System, there's actually 12 districts in our country. Our Federal Reserve Bank is in St. Louis, sorry. Now, Federal Reserve, you can actually see, is actually on every dollar bill you have. So what does the Federal Reserve do? They control the amount of money that is put into circulation. And it's not just put on a whim, because if they put too much, it would inflate society and things would be worth, it'd be more difficult. And if they put too little, it would deflate society, and so there has to be a delicate balance. Now, the really key thing to know about the Federal Reserve System is it's independent. The President cannot tell them you need to put more money in. Congress cannot tell them. I can't tell them. You can't tell them. Now, they do have to tell Congress, hey, I'm going to do this. If anything else, you're just telling them so they can warn the other people. and things like that. Now, the last two things go with the Federal Reserve and what their big powers are. First off, these are the whole idea about money. All right? So money has to be storable, it has to be divisible, it has to be transportable, it has to be recognizable, it has to be difficult to copy. Okay? This all falls under what we call elastic money. So the elastic money, the Federal Reserve can either expand, put more money in society. It would cause inflation, but this is done a lot to pay down debt so people can get back on their feet. Or they can shrink it based on what's going on. Again, this is completely their decision, and there's nothing that Congress or anybody else can do about it. Now, the last thing they control is called the discount rate. When you go to buy a home later in life or a car, and you ask for a loan from the bank, that Regions or Bancorp South or Wells Fargo or First Tennessee is not giving you that money. What happened is they're calling up the super bank, and the super bank is called the Fed, the Federal Reserve. And they'll go, okay, we're going to loan you that money to give to that person for the bank, but we have to charge interest. Your interest rate is determined by the discount rate. The discount rate is basically the interest charged from the bank. So when you're paying back your loan, you're actually paying back the money to the bank, Regions, so they can pay back the super bank, the Fed. And that's how our federal money system works, and it seems to work fairly easily. Now, there has been a bad time where it didn't work out so well. That was called the Great Depression, and we'll see what was done to really kind of rectify that and change it, all right?